Welcome back to our study of Old Testament history. We're studying the history of the Hebrew nation. This is lesson 38 in our series. We're in the United Kingdom. Last time we basically finished David's reign. Now we're ready to begin the reign of Solomon, his son. Before we do begin actually Solomon's reign, let's go back into chapter 2 of 1 Kings and see David's final charge to Solomon. David is an old man. He's not even able to get heat at night. So Abishag, a virgin, has been brought into David's bed, not to be his wife, but to warm him during the night. But she is thought by all of the land to be David's last wife. And that's going to be important in our study today. David is about to die, so he calls Solomon to him in chapter 2, verse 1. And let's notice the 4 charges that he gives Solomon before we study Solomon's execution of that in establishing his authority. When the time came near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong and show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways, keep his decrees and his commands, his laws and requirements, as is written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. Here's the promise. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. So his first charge to Solomon was to walk faithfully before the Lord, to observe all the Lord's decrees and commandments and laws and requirements, and thus show himself to be a man. A real man keeps the law of God. But then, beginning in verse 5 and going through verse 6, he says, see that Joab is judged. He said, you saw what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me. How he killed Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle. And with that blood stained the belt around the waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. He says, do it right, do it lawfully, but see that Joab dies. He says, but show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, for when I was fleeing from Absalom, they let me eat at their table. Then in verses 8 to 9, he says, see that Shammai dies. Shammai, you remember, this Benjamite that cursed him. He says, you remember how he called bitter curses down upon me when he came to meet me at the Jordan. I swore to him by the Lord, I'll not put you to death by the sword. But now, do not consider him innocent. You're a man of wisdom, and you'll know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. Says, see that Shammai dies. Then David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. David is dead. His seed is upon the throne. Now we're going to study and see if Solomon will be the righteous king that David was till the day he died. I know David committed evil, but he was still the righteous king until the day he died. Solomon begins immediately to establish his authority. Adonijah, back in 1 Kings chapter 1, had set himself up as a rival king while David still lived. Bathsheba had gone to her husband David and got him to announce that Solomon, her son, was to be king and not Adonijah. Now that Solomon's throne is firmly established, Adonijah goes to Bathsheba. And he says to Bathsheba, or Bathsheba says to him, do you come peacefully? And he says, yes, I come peacefully. I've got something to say to you. He says, you may say it. He says, what I want you to know, what I want you to get, what I want you to realize, that the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as a king. But now the things have changed, and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it's come to him from the Lord. I've only got one request. Will you not refuse me? She says, make it. He said, please ask King Solomon. He will not refuse you. to give me Abishag, the Shunammite, as his wife. Now Bathsheba won't mind that at all. For Bathsheba, like all of Israel, had considered Abishag the last wife of David. And Abishag had done what Bathsheba could not. That is, give King David heat in the last few days of his life. Very well, said Bathsheba. I'll ask the king for you. Adonijah knows what he's doing. If he can get the lady as his wife that Israel thinks was David's last wife, then he may have a right yet, a power yet to the throne. So Bathsheba goes into Solomon, and she sits on the throne beside Solomon. And she says to Solomon, give me one request, or says, ask of Solomon one request. She says, make it, my mother. I'll not refuse you. So let Abishag, the Shunammite, be given in marriage to your brother Adonijah. But Solomon says, why do you request Abishag for Adonijah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. For after all, he is my older brother. Yes, ask the kingdom for him, and for Abiathar the priest, and Joab son of Zeruiah. King Solomon swore by the Lord, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if Adonijah does not pay with his life for this request. For surely as the Lord lives, who has established me securely on the throne, Adonijah shall be put to death today. It seems like an innocent request, but it's not. He is striving to be king, and Solomon in his wisdom knew it. So King Solomon gave order to Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. This is his Joab, his commander of chief. And he struck down Adonijah, and he died. His kingdom is now established. The rebel is now dead. To Abiathar, the priest that had gone after Joab and Adonijah rather than Solomon, he says, you go back to your fields in Anathoth. That's where Jeremiah came from, which makes us think maybe Jeremiah was a priest. Go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I'll not put you to death, because you bear the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father David and shared all my hardships. So Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood, fulfilling the word of the Lord. The Lord had spoken by Shiloh about the house of Eli. This is the last descendant of Eli ever to be priest. So he has killed Adonijah and deposed Abiathar. Now that news reaches Joab. Now Joab had conspired with Adonijah against Solomon, although he had not conspired with Absalom against David. So when he finds that Solomon is cleaning house, he flees to the tent of the Lord, to the tabernacle, and took hold of the horns of the altar, the most sacred place of refuge in all of Israel. He didn't go to a city of refuge. He went to the most sacred place of refuge. He has no right to either, because he has killed in peace as if it were in war. King Solomon was told that Joab had gone into the tent. So Solomon said to Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, go, strike him down. So Benaiah entered the tent and said to Joab, the king said, come out. He said, no, I will die here. So Benaiah went back and told the king. Joab said he'd die there. So the king says, okay, do as he says. Strike him down there and bury him. He has no right to refuge, not even in the tent of the Lord. And clear me and my father's house of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab shed. The Lord will repay him for the blood he shed, because without the knowledge of my father, he attacked 2 men and killed them with a sword, both of them. Abner son of Ner, commander of Israel's army, and Amasa son of Jether, commander of Judah's army, were better men and more upright than he. May the guilt of their blood rest on the head of Joab and his descendants forever. But on David and his descendants, his house and his throne, may there be the Lord's peace forever. So Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, went up, struck down Joab, and killed him, and buried him on his own land in the desert. The king put Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, over the army in Joab's position, and replaced Abiathar with Zadok the priest. Now he's done everything that David had said except one thing. And he takes care of that in verses 36 through 46 of 1 Kings chapter 2. Shimei, the Benjamite, that had cursed David as he was fleeing from Absalom, now is to be taken care of. Solomon went to Shimei because he's going to use wisdom in seeing that Shimei deserves to die today, not just for his past deeds. He tells Shimei, you build a house in the city of Jerusalem, and as long as you live in that house, I'll guarantee you peace. Everything will be fine with you. But the day you cross the brook Kidron, that's how you will leave Jerusalem. In the day you cross that brook, in that day you will stand guilty of sin against me, and you will die. Shimei answered the king and says, what you say is good. Your servant will do as the king has said. And Shimei stayed in the city a long time. 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's slaves ran off, and he was told, your slaves are in Gath. He saddled his donkey and went to Achish at Gath in search of his slaves, and he brought his slaves back from Gath. When Solomon was told that he'd gone from Jerusalem, he called Shimei to him, and he said, did not I make you swear that you would not leave to go anywhere, and that the day you did, you could be sure you will die? At that time you said to me, I will obey. Why did you not keep your oath to the Lord and obey the command? The king said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the evil you did to my father. The Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing, but King Solomon will be blessed, and David's throne will remain secure before the Lord forever. The Lord gave the order to Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. He's Solomon's hatchet man. And he went out and struck Shimei and killed him. The kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hand. So with 4 and the 5th to come, Solomon establishes his authority, that he is the one in authority and not David. The next thing that he did, though making an alliance and establishing his authority, was outside of the will of God. And Solomon now begins to betray that he has a good heart, but not the perfect heart that David had. Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh in chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. The alliance was already somewhat wrong. The marrying of the daughter was totally wrong. He was not to marry outside of Israel. He brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. He has a good heart. He loves the Lord, and he wants to do the Lord's will, but he doesn't have the perfect heart that David had. And so Solomon has already begun to betray that he is more interested in authority and in alliances with the nation round about him than he is in the separateness and the purity that is demanded in his day of the people of God. In chapter 3, beginning with verse 4, the king went up to Gibeah to offer sacrifices because it was the most important place. And there Solomon burnt 1,000 burnt offerings upon the altar. He really wants to worship God, but he doesn't understand Psalms 51. And that is, the Lord doesn't want all these burnt offerings. He wants a broken and a contrite heart. Yet God appeared to him in a dream, and he says, ask whatever you want, and it'll be given you. He thought, I'm sure, for a moment, and he says, you showed great kindness to my father David. I am but a child. I do not know how to rule this people Israel. Give me therefore a wise and an understanding heart, a discerning heart, to govern your people. Who is able to govern this people of yours? That's saying, please the Lord. And he says, since you've not asked for yourself long life or wealth, I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there never has been anybody as wise before you, and there never will be anybody as wise after you. Moreover, because you asked for the right thing, I will give you that which you did not ask for. Both riches and honor will be yours. And if you will walk in my ways, I will give you a long life. Then Solomon awoke, for it was a dream. He went back home, offered more sacrifices in Jerusalem, and worshiped God. Then immediately, there's an example of his wisdom. 2 women, each have a baby. In the middle of the night, one woman's baby dies because the mother lays upon the baby. She switches the babies. In the morning, the woman who has the dead baby knows it's not hers. Women can tell which baby is theirs. They finally go to Solomon for a ruling, both claiming that this child is theirs. Solomon said, well, this is an easy thing. Give me the child. We'll cut the child in two with a sword, and you take half of the baby, and you take half the baby. Immediately, the woman whose child it was said, no, no, no. Give her the child. And the other woman's willing to take the child. So Solomon now knows the lady who protested the death of the child was the one to whom the child belongs. And that saying went all over Israel. And they saw the greatness and the power of Solomon's wisdom. Now you and I, after the occasion, may think, well, I'd have thought of that too. But I don't think we would have. Solomon knew that a true mother would not allow the child to die. But the false mother, the one whose it was not, would. In chapter 4, we're hurrying in this lesson because we're going to cover all of Solomon in this lesson. You have an outline, read all the text. In 1 Kings chapter 4, you have Solomon's officials and governors named, and Solomon's daily provision. First of all, I read in verse 21 that Solomon ruled all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. He ruled all the promised land. I want you to notice his daily provisions. Of course, he didn't need all this. But this is how many servants and how many people he had in his royal household. Solomon's daily provision, verse 22, was 185 bushels of fine flour and 375 bushels of meal, 10 heads of stall-fed cattle, 20 of pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer and gazelle and roebucks and choice fowl. He must have had one huge amount of tables to feed that much food to that many people. Solomon had in verse 26 4,000 stalls for chariot horses and 12,000 horses. They brought his provisions to King Solomon, and all who came to the king's table, they saw to it that nothing was lacking. Solomon, verse 26, God gave Solomon wisdom and great insight. Verse 32, he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He wrote books on plant life. He taught about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So Solomon had power and wealth and wisdom like no king had ever had before him. In chapter 5 through chapter 7, he builds the temple. Fabulous story. Read those 4 chapters. 3 chapters. Solomon builds a fabulous temple for God and a fabulous palace for himself with the help of Hiram, who brought 4.5 tons of gold to Solomon to help build the temple, as well as all the cedars of Lebanon to build his palace. Solomon then dedicates the temple in chapter 8. You need to read that, particularly the prayer of dedication, where Solomon talks about the fact that all the people of God not only will come here to worship, but they'll come here to find the answer to all of their problems and the solution to all their difficulties. And he says, even when the stranger comes, the foreigner, and he prays from this place, Lord, I want you to hear from heaven and heal him, so that all the world will know that there is a God in Israel, that you're the God of all of the earth. Beautiful prayer of dedication. In chapter 9, God makes a covenant with Solomon, as he'd made a covenant with Abraham and with David. Read with me starting in verse 1. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace and achieved all he desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I've heard the prayer and the plea you've made before me. I have consecrated this temple which you've built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and my laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail a man on the throne. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and the decrees I've given you and go off and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I've consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People answer, because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster upon them. And so the Lord covenants with Abraham, similar to the covenant of blessing and cursing in Deuteronomy 28. Do my will, you'll always be blessed. Don't do my will, and you will always be cursed. Starting in 9:10 and going all the way through chapter 10, you have further evidence of Solomon's glory. Hiram, for instance, as we've already said, in verse 14, had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. That's 4.5 tons. Can you imagine 4.5 tons of gold? In verse 25, 3 times a year, Solomon offered sacrifice, burnt offerings, and fellowship offerings on the altar he'd built for the Lord, burning incense before the Lord along with them, and so fulfilled the temple obligations. Of course, he himself did not burn them. Priests carried them in to be burnt. In verse 26, further evidence of Solomon's glory. He built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath in Edom on the shore of the Red Sea. Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. They sailed to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold at 16 tons, which they delivered to King Solomon. So he has 20.5 tons of gold already because of Hiram's help, because of Hiram's covenant with him. In chapter 10, the queen of Sheba, which would be the queen of Egypt, comes to see if Solomon is as wise and as powerful as she's been told. After she sees Solomon's glory, she says in chapter 10 and verse 7, indeed not even the half was told me. And she gave King Solomon, in verse 10, 120 talents of gold. That's 4.5 tons of gold again. And I read down in verse, she goes home, and I read down in verse 14, the weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents. That's 25 tons of gold a year come into this man's treasury. He is the richest king, probably, that ever was upon the face of the earth. In verse 23 of chapter 10, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. Verse 26, Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 14,000 chariots and 12,000 horses, in spite of the fact that God had said in Deuteronomy 17, you will not multiply horses. Until that time, David had ridden upon mules. Adonijah had ridden upon mules. Absalom had ridden upon mules. But now Solomon trusts in himself, in his power, in his wisdom, and in his horses. He is doomed. More than that, in chapter 11, you have apostasy, religious apostasy, and the resulting judgment. King Solomon, however, that word however is in spite of all of his wisdom. He loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughters. Like Samson, he loved the wrong kind of women. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonian, Hittites. They were from the nations that the Lord had said, you must not intermarry with them. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his heart turned after other gods. His heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as David has been. He followed the Ashtaroth of the Sidonians and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. He begins to build temples to these idols, to these foreign gods for his wives, until finally God appears to him and said, that's it. I have rejected you. I will divide the kingdom from you. And the Lord began to raise up adversaries against Solomon. Hadad the Edomite from Egypt and Rezon began to fight against Solomon and to take territories away, those south and those north in Syria. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, was a strong adversary against Solomon and began to fight for the empire itself. And finally Solomon ran him out of the country, and he fled to Egypt, to Shishak the king, and will not be back until Solomon is dead and Rehoboam his son reigns in his stead. Solomon started well, a man of great wisdom, but now he's ending his journey a fool, and one who follows the women in his life rather than the Lord of his life. Read with me in 1 Kings 11, starting with verse 41. As for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the book of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all of Israel 40 years. Then he rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David his father. And Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. Now if we had time, we'd do something I'm going to ask you to do. When you shut off the set today, read the book of Ecclesiastes and see that Solomon in his old age looked at all that he'd done, looking for happiness under the sun, and concluded that all the gold and all the women and all of this was vanity and a trying to catch the wind. And he concluded the last statement in his life, this is the only thing that matters: fear God and keep His commandments, for that's all there is to man. Learn from Solomon. Do not do as he did. Fear God. Keep His commandments. More next time.